As with every project, it started with me taking the measurements and putting them up on my chalkboard so they were always in sight, and then I could separate the material that I wanted to use. In this case, I was using a timber called Meranti, and this was a fairly low-grade timber, unfortunately. I was originally going to use this timber for a cot, but I decided that was far too big and far too much weight for this timber, so instead I scaled it down to the bassinet. I cut all the pieces to size using a stop block wherever I needed to make repeat cuts. This really came in handy for cutting the slats. With all the pieces cut, I could start marking out for the dowels. I had 3 dowels on each end of the stiles, and once those were marked, I could take it over to the drill press. Once I had all the holes drilled, I used these dowel center points to mark the location of the dowels on the rails. Squeezing the boards together made a small indent in the end grain of the rails, and then I could go back with a pencil and just add a little dot so I didn't lose the mark. I've found the best way to get a perpendicular hole through the timber at these sort of heights on the drill press is to use a speed square, holding it against the table and the timber. What you want? You want me to go throw that for you? The next thing for me to do is to take these rails and make some notches or some mortises so that I can put the slats in running through this way. Now I've just realized that I've kind of done this a bit arse about face. I really should have put the slats in first and then worked the stiles onto that. That way I could have extended the length of the stiles and cut them to size. I've done one, I know it works. It just means that I've got to be very careful about how much I take off on the shoulders so that all of these inside lengths are the same. So it can be done, but next time I'll do the slats first, and I think that'll just make life a lot easier. To get the majority of the material out for those slats, I started at the drill press, then I took it over to my bench where I could use a router with an edge guide to make sure that I got a perfectly straight line. As I mentioned earlier, I really should have started with the slats, but because of the way I'd done this, I had to measure each shoulder length and then I could cut those to size. For this glue up I went with epoxy because it gives you a lot more open time, so because there were a lot of parts to work with it made sense. But it's also because there was an end grain join where the rails met the stile. So using epoxy just means that you have a little bit of added insurance because wood glue doesn't do much of a bond when you're joining end grain. Now that I've got the 2 side panels done, I can move on to the long panel. Now, there's only going to be one long panel with slats, and I feel like everything I've learned doing these 2, I should be able to put into place. So this process should go fairly smoothly. The next step is for me to mark out the gaps between the slats along these rails. I've got a block here which is the slat gap and the slats included, so I can use that to work along. This is much more foolproof than using a tape measure. I've found this is a surefire way of introducing mistakes. Now it's very tempting to just start on one end and work your way along, but the problem is any mistakes along the way are going to compound and you're going to end up in a situation where your gaps change from one end to the other, and that's going to be noticeable. A much better solution is to start on both ends and work towards the middle. That's going to do two things. It's essentially going to halve your chance of making a mistake or seeing those mistakes compounded, but also if there is any discrepancy, you're going to see it in the middle and it's going to make the overall piece look symmetrical. So you might have all the same and then a slightly bigger gap in the middle, but that's fine, you can get away with that. It looks a lot better than having a small gap on this end and a big gap on this end. Now I could basically repeat the steps that I had done before, over to the drill press to remove the majority of the material, back to the bench with the router to make sure that I get a nice straight even cut. Using the router to cut the shoulder to size. And then I could glue all of the slats in place. This is one of the reasons why you use epoxy in this case, because getting all of these slats to line up with the holes took quite a while, so having that extra open time was a lifesaver. Once the epoxy had dried, I finished off these panels using a hand plane and some sandpaper, and then I rounded all of the edges off using a router. This would just make sure that whenever there's any little hands nearby, there's not going to be any splinters and little fingers. So frustratingly, I accidentally deleted all of the footage of me bringing these 4 panels together. But to be fair, it was basically the same joinery that you saw me doing on these 2 sides, just with simple dowels. I added a decorative top cap to the entire bassinet using some of the leftover Meranti. I cut the boards down to rough length and then put them through the thicknesser to get them all to a uniform size, and then I could glue them in place. Next up were the hinges. These are just some basic brass decorative face mounting hinges. And here I'm adding the rails for the mattress support. I ended up going with MDF for this instead of slats. That was mostly just so that I could give the entire bassinet some rigidity. And because the mattress is going to be so small, I don't see it a problem having to remove it all the time to air it out. One of the things that I want to add to this co-sleeper is the ability for it to rock back and forth. So it's going to sit in 2 arms, those are going to hold it up, and then it should be able to swing back and forth from a pivot point. So for that pivot, I'm going to be using this 25mm dowel. Now the problem is this is an 18mm thick piece of relatively soft wood. So if I was to just slide this in and glue that there, all of that weight is going to be on this very thin piece of material. Now, as much as it's going to be a snug fit, I just don't have a lot of confidence in that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a second circular piece, glue that on, and then go through, and that way I'm going to end up with 36mm of material holding this on. If I make it big and chunky, I think that's going to look quite nice. But as well as that, it's also going to act as a washer between the leg and the bassinet, just giving it a bit of clearance. Using a dowel as a center point, I could clamp that disc in place, making sure to keep the grain direction the same as the rail. And once that had dried, I could come back with a 25mm spade bit and drill through from both sides to create the hole for the dowel. I put the dowel in using epoxy again to follow the idea that it gives you some bonding in the end grain, and then I used some methylated spirits to clean up any of the squeeze out. On the folding panel there was a bit of a crack forming, so I added a Dutchman or bow tie to keep that together. It was also just a nice detail to add to the overall piece. And that was the bassinet done, so I could add some oil and put this aside to dry while I worked on the legs. For the legs, I went with a timber called Tasmanian oak. I'll link to a Paul Jenkins video where he explains where this timber comes from and its strange naming convention. Tasmanian oak is a lot harder than Meranti, and because these are legs holding up my future child, I wanted to make sure that they were really strong and solid. I went with a sort of half flat join here, sandwiching the upright between two perpendicular pieces. This added weight to the bottom of the legs, which lowered the center of gravity, which just helps to stop the entire thing from falling over. Once the glue had dried, I could drill a 25mm hole into these legs, and this would be where the bassinet would rest in. This would be the pivot point. To join the two legs, I went with a through mortise and tenon, so here I'm notching out material in the legs so that I can put the rail through. This fit ended up being really snug. After doing a dry fit, it felt rock solid. It didn't even need any glue. So I've got no concerns about this rail being the only thing that's stopping the legs from racking. I needed to come up with a way to stop the bassinet from swinging if I needed. So what I went with was a dowel rod that runs right through the legs and into the bassinet. And then the last thing to do was add some oil to the leg assembly, wait for it to dry, and it was ready to put together. Overall, I am so happy with the way this one turned out. Let me walk you through some of the features. The first one is that it's on wheels, so this entire thing can be pushed around the house really easily. The idea is that while this is a co-sleeper, I also want to use it as a cot or bassinet. So being able to just push it from one room to the next with the baby in it is going to make life so easy. As well as being a bassinet, this is also a co-sleeper, which means that while I'm sleeping, I can have the baby pushed right up against the bed next to me, so it's in contact all the time. So to turn it into co-sleeping mode, I pull out these rods and then the front folds down. So now you can wheel this right up against the bed and have the baby right next to you. Right now this dowel rod is going through the legs, through the bassinet, and it's stopping the entire thing from moving. So if I pull this rod out, the bassinet can now be rocked back and forth, which is going to be great if the baby likes that rocking motion. And then finally, if I want to move the baby and the bassinet together out of this leg assembly, I can pick it up. And now the bassinet can be used away from that leg assembly. So thanks again for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this video, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. And if you enjoy this type of content, I'd like to encourage you to subscribe. So thanks again, and I'll talk to you guys soon.